lecture. So for today, we'll be talking about political parties, a little bit about participation, some about interest groups, a little bit on elections. Especially to get to political parties, sometimes it takes going through some of these other things to hopefully make them make sense. And in particular, while we'll talk about political parties generally, we'll also be focusing more specifically on the Democrats and Republicans, the two main parties in the United States, since in practice, if we're talking about political parties in the US, we're talking about these two. There can be other parties that can have some influence in, say, certain types of local elections, or it can have effects in sort of quirky elections of one form or another. So the Reform Party, Libertarians, the Greens, people like that. But for the most part, if we want to talk about the parties that matter, we're talking about Democrats and Republicans. And yeah, there's our overview. So as you can see, we have quite a bit we're going to be talking about today. So participation, broadly speaking, some of the actors in state politics, interest groups, political culture, then to why are there two parties, kind of reviewing that thing about first past the post again, talking about party platforms. So this is something that's going to be a bit of a difference between many of the American parties versus, say, ones in Europe or Japan or in other places, as well as some of the general sort of policy preferences that exist between the two parties. We're going to be speaking very broadly about Democrats and Republicans, but things that more or less remain accurate. So in terms of participation, so again, because we're not going to have specific lectures on participation in state and local politics, here we're just going to talk about it a little bit more broadly. One of the big things to note is that participation in state politics and local politics is substantially easier than it is at the national level. So there are a few reasons for this. First is, again, the state representatives cover a smaller district. So say if I'm in College Station, Texas, the state representative probably covers maybe 100 or 200,000 constituents, versus the representative to the American House of Representatives, where that individual probably covers somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 to maybe 1 million people. As a constituent, I'm probably going to have a much better chance of influencing that state representative. My vote matters a lot more for that guy than for the House of Representatives member. Obviously, any politician will want to have as many votes as possible, but if you're one vote out of 200,000 versus one vote out of 1 million, each individual vote matters substantially more, and therefore you could have more influence. Second is just simply a matter of access. That if you're trying to access, say, the state capitol, or if at the local level you're trying to deal with county commissioners or the city mayor or the city council or something like that, it's just practically easier to interact with them. So again, if you look at, say, a map of most states, so if you look at a map of states that have state capitals, generally speaking, there are exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, you'll notice that geographically the capital is usually in the center of the state, and that's intentional. The idea was that you wanted to make sure that there was as much as possible to try and equalize distance in terms of people in the state going to the state capital, so that there wouldn't be, so for instance, in the case of Texas, Texas's capital is Austin, which is more or less in the center of the state. If the capital was, say, up in the very northernmost tip of Texas, it'd be a lot harder for people, say, in San Antonio or Houston or Galveston, places in the southern part of the state, to actually reach the capital. Or similarly, if the capital was in Houston, people in the northern part of the state would have a much harder time to actually be able to access it. The idea is you want people to have a better opportunity to interact, including even in person, with their state representatives, and even more so at the city level and at the county level. This aids in participation. It's a lot easier to participate if you're actually there. And indeed, also just in terms of things like, say, even things like the type of personal interaction. So it can be a lot harder to personally interact with a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate in the American National Congress in Washington, D.C. Not just in terms of distance getting there, but also in terms of getting through security, making appointments, things of that type. Generally speaking, it's a lot simpler to do that with state and local officials. They're not usually as highly secured in many ways. There's not as much in terms of, certainly there's security of these things, but it's not at the same level when you're dealing with the national government. And also it's just more expected that there's going to be more kind of general interaction. So for instance, it would not be, so let's say for instance, you're a constituent in the state of Indiana, and you're visiting the Capitol in Indianapolis. If you're visiting the Capitol building, if you're visiting where the state legislature is, and you think, I'd like to swing by the office of my representative, that's more easy to do. Potentially, you may just need to make a quick phone call to say, hey, is the representative there? I'd like to speak with him, or one of his representative, or one of his staff members. Chances are you probably will have a good shot of actually succeeding, versus if I was doing that in Washington, D.C., where it would probably be substantially harder to do that. So participation just at a physical level is simpler. So too, also dealing with the political party. Now, one thing to note, this is something we'll talk about again in detail a little bit later, is that the party system in the United States, so we talk about the Democrats and Republicans broadly as kind of national parties, which is kind of accurate and kind of not. Yes, there is a sort of Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention, sort of broad parties in the national level. But technically, at an organizational level, the parties are organized by state. So if we're talking about the Republican National Convention, so national party, what we're really talking about is the combination of the 50 state parties in this convention. So it's the Republican Party of Texas and the Republican Party of Ohio, the Republican Party of California, who are all talking together in this national convention. The actual national organization tends to be comparatively weaker, something we'll get to in a little bit. So that being the case, it's a lot easier to access the state and local parties. So if I'm trying to talk to the, say, chairperson of the Democratic National Convention, unless I am very well connected, a very large contributor, or someone who has some other level of importance, chances are I'm probably not going to be able to interact with them. Versus, say, the chairperson of the county Democratic political party, so like say Brazos County Democratic Party unit. Chances are I will be able to talk to him or her very easily. Indeed, that person probably very much would want to talk with people. So being able to interact with them, access them, and influence them at the state and local level tends to be much simpler. And again, finally, one of the reasons for this sort of participation is that, again, the majority of laws and regulations and services and all of this are in day-to-day life are made at the local and state level. So that being the case, if you want to make a practical change, you're usually going to participate at that level. So for instance, if someone wants to have a great influence on a local community, for instance, one of the best positions to try and run for would be the zoning board. So we talked about zoning briefly in one of the earlier lectures, I think one of the previous sections. Basically, the board that determines what kind of buildings can be built in certain areas in town. That's usually an elected office. Usually it's an elected office of various people. If you want to have a major impact on your local community, being part of the zoning board or attending zoning board meetings and things like that is a big way to participate. And in practical day-to-day affairs, it's probably going to have much more of an influence than me trying to talk to, say, my member of the House of Representatives or Senate at the national level, much less the president. Now, in terms of people who are acting in state politics, so political parties, while they're obviously engaged in the government itself, aren't technically part of the government. And there are a large number of other people who are engaged with government who also aren't like this. And this is what makes up what's called the civil society. So civil society basically means that level of society between the state and individuals and families. Because the notion is, in American political theory anyway, is that you want to have a very developed and very thick civil society. Because the idea is that this ends up being somewhat of a defense for the individual versus the state. If the state is coming after you as an individual, your chances aren't great. Whether it's in terms of, say, something like a court case or legal regulations or taxes or something of that type, the individual is in a very precarious position if an individual or an individual family is trying to deal with government. But the idea of civil society is made up of numerous other groups, institutions, and things like that that can serve as sort of a protective barrier. So if I'm part of, let's say I'm very involved in my church, or that I'm very involved with a workers' union, or if I'm involved with a professional association. So let's say I'm a professional engineer and involved with the activities that maybe exist inside a professional association in my area. These types of connections serve as kind of a protective barrier. So if the government is coming after me in some sense in terms of regulations and so forth, it's not just me, myself, trying to push back. Now, effectively, I have allies. Now I have a protective sort of shield that is not just me, one individual. So let's say, for instance, the government decides it wants to add a 30% income tax rate on engineers. For me as an individual engineer, I can try and push to try and stop this. But again, as one person, probably I'm not going to have much of an ability. But if I'm part of this larger group of professional engineers who group together and then can try and lobby the government and make their case and so forth, now I am in a better position. Now I'm not alone. Or the term that's sometimes used for this kind of, if you're just stuck on your own, would be atomization. So atomization basically means when a society is broken down that everyone is sort of stuck as an individual who don't have necessarily connections they can make with others. With the idea being that full atomization of a society is the kind of thing you see in a totalitarian state. So for instance, if any of you have read 1984, George Orwell's novel about this sort of thing, that would be an atomized society. Not only are you an individual basically unprotected against the government, but also you can't necessarily trust anyone else. No one else is going to be looking for you. For all you know, they're going to turn you in, they're going to snitch on you. That's an atomized population where you really are alone in a very strong sense. The notion with civil society is to try and prevent that as much as possible. With the notion being, if you have a very developed civil society, hopefully you have a well-ordered society. Hopefully you have a society where, yes, the government is active, is doing what it needs to, but it also is prevented from being oppressive towards individuals. And on the other hand, that certain individuals or families can't over-dominate the state, is the hope. So when we mention things like a group of engineers working together, this would be a kind of interest group, and both national and state politics are filled with interest groups. Now, an interest group, again, we kind of mentioned them briefly in the first part of the class when we were talking about factions. That, I guess if we want to put it definitionally, or kind of as a syllogism, well, not a syllogism, but as a comparison, every faction is an interest group, but not every interest group is a faction. So again, factions are a group of people who share some sort of common goal or common passion or trait, and who try and advance that against the rights of others as well as against the permanent interests of the state. Negative. Versus an interest group. They certainly could be like a faction, and many of them are, but an interest group is a group of people who are gathered together based on some similar trait or similar goal or similar passion, but doesn't necessarily mean that there's some assumption that they're trying to do things against the state or against the other parts of the population. They're just a group of people who are trying to advance policies they prefer. Again, they can become factions, but doesn't mean that necessarily they have to be. A lot of American politics, national level, but especially also at the state and local level, is made up of interest groups of various levels of size, financial resources, things like that. They can just be something almost like a neighborhood group, all the way up to some of the national interest groups that you see of something like, say, interest groups for, say, energy producers, or for pharmaceutical companies, or for groups like the NAACP, so one based on African-American traits and things of that type, or self-perception. Theoretically, almost anything can be an interest group. Kind of, again, going back to something like factions. Especially at the state level, this is why you tend to get a lot of variety. Because not only can almost anything be an interest group, but also if you're trying to influence state politics, you don't need the same sort of mass of financial resources or sheer number of bodies that you would at the national level. So for instance, if I'm an interest group, if I'm part of an interest group trying to influence Congress, people whose constituency, so if I want to just try and influence, say, 30%, about a third of Congress, thinking of the current American population, their constituency would come up to being about 110 million people. Obviously, my interest group's not going to have 110 million people. But if I'm going to try and influence people who are representing that kind of constituency, I'm going to need a large amount of geographical spread, large amount of people, large amount of money. Versus in a state where, again, if we're dealing with something like, say, professional engineers, given both their importance as well as, say, their influence, if I'm trying to influence regulations at the state level, I'll have a better shot. So in terms of things that interest groups can be based on, they can be based on occupation, so something like professional engineer, union membership, so if I'm, say, a member of a truckers union, race, so the NAACP being an example, La Raza, though I don't remember what they've changed their name to, being based more on Hispanic identity, things of that type. Religion, so groups like the Catholic League and things of that type. Also things like shared experiences. So you have interest groups of, say, people who had previously been in the military, so veterans, so the veterans of foreign wars would be an example. So that's a group that's more of a fraternal association, but sometimes has interest group elements to it, of people who had been in the military, but who had specifically served during a time when there was an overseas war of some type that the Americans were involved in. It could also be based on ideology. So say certain types of, so like say environmentalism, anti-abortion, things of that type. It could also be focused on specific topics. So something like Gun Owners of America, focused on trying to keep gun rights pretty open, protection of animals with things like the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, groups like that. Again, effectively almost anything could be an interest group. And again with this, also that you can have groups that aren't technically or aren't typically interest groups who at certain points become them, even if only temporarily. So again, we'll use the Veterans of Foreign Wars as an example. So shared experience group, more of a fraternal organization, almost like a club in a way, of people who'd been in the military during the time of foreign war. So if someone had served in World War I, or World War II, or the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, or in the first Iraq War in the 1990s, or in the Bosnia-Herzegovina War, or in Afghanistan, Iraq, places of this type. Primarily kind of like a club. Not really active in politics. That's not his point. But at some points, it has gotten involved in trying to lobby. So one of the big ones of this being something like, say, at the state level. One thing that states will do is on car license plates, you can have specialized license plates that you pay an additional amount for. So it could be customizing your number or something like that, but it can also be certain types of artwork, with the idea being that this kind of artwork, then the money gets transferred to some group. So for instance, like land preservation or to animal shelters or something of that type. One thing that became more of an issue in, say, the 1990s and late 1980s was the idea of missing in action veterans, especially those from the Vietnam War. So when the Vietnam War ended, there was still a not minor number of soldiers who no one knew what happened to. They didn't seem to have gone AWOL, so it didn't look like they'd run, that they deserted their posts. It also, there was no record of them being killed, so there's no collection of their bodies. It wasn't clear if they'd been captured by the North Vietnamese forces and were inside prison camps or what. Especially for Vietnam veterans, that became kind of a big deal. So one of the things that the VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, would do is they would push states to have a specialized license plate. It would be an MIA POW, prisoner of war license plate, where the idea is that someone could buy that and the funds would go effectively to a organization that would try and help seek out what happened to these veterans, as well as try and provide benefits for their family members, their surviving family members. Since if a soldier is found killed in action or something of that type, there are certain types of benefits that come to their surviving family members. If they're missing in action, not so much. So the idea was that would be for that. This is trying to have political influence. This is them trying to change a policy of the state government. So I think one of the cases of this was in the state of Nebraska, I think, of all places. VFW, generally not involved in politics, but in this case was lobbying members of Congress, members of the state legislature, lobbying the governor, lobbying others to try and get this passed, who, as memory serves, succeeded. Proving, done. And then it goes back to just being a fraternal club. It generally doesn't get as much involved in politics again. Versus, say, something like, say, a group like, say, in Texas, I don't remember its exact title, but an interest group such as the Energy Producers of Texas. This is an interest group of basic industries that are involved in, say, fracking, natural gas, oil, the energy sector. This is a professional interest group. It's always been an interest group. It's not a fraternal club. Its entire purpose is simply try and influence government. So it's not something separate. Again, at the state level, you have a great deal of variety with all of this. The reason for bringing this up is because when we're talking about political parties, there are some things that parties do that seem kind of similar to interest groups, but they are separate. Interest groups and parties can have a great deal of interaction, of course. They can have a great deal of strong interaction, though there are some limits based in law on how much they can interact. But it's good to kind of separate out what an interest group does versus what a party does, since they can kind of blur. And again, going back to, say, the Federalist Papers, when we were talking about factions, for someone like Madison and some of the early guys, they tended to, again, they didn't really want political parties to exist in the United States. In their description of political party, interest group, and faction would have effectively all been the same thing. They wouldn't have made a distinction necessarily. While that may have been the right call back in 1789, obviously we need to make distinctions now. And even, say, by 1798, they would have made some of these distinctions, no doubt. So interest groups do, especially at the state level. There are various things that they're focused upon. One of the big ones is bill monitoring. So in a state legislature, you have multiple bills that will be proposed. So like we talked about in the state legislature lecture, multiple bills will be proposed. They're going through committees and subcommittees, this, that, and the other. One of the big things that interest groups do is they monitor this. So for instance, someone I'd known many, many years ago, she was very involved with Planned Parenthood, sort of pro-abortion group in the United States, among other things that they do. And one of the things they would do is bill monitoring. So in the state of Louisiana, apparently there was a bill that wanted to limit that wanted to put some restrictions on, say, when abortion could be done without certain other types of things like, say, issues of the health of the mother or something of that type. Again, it's one bill out of hundreds, if not thousands, in Louisiana. Most people aren't going to be aware of it, but because Planned Parenthood in Louisiana was very focused on this for ideological and financial reasons, as soon as that bill comes forward, they send out a message and an email to their various supporters saying, oh my gosh, there's this new bill inside Louisiana. Please contact your representatives to tell them how against this you are. Bill monitoring kind of becomes an important thing with interest groups because they have a motivated reason to pay attention. Versus most rest of us who, I mean, honestly, if you're looking through, say, a legislative record, especially things like bills being proposed and things of that type, unless you're really into it, it tends to be dreary and dull. And given some of the technicalities with it in terms of parliamentary procedure, oftentimes, unless someone has some training in this, you don't even know necessarily what it means when a bill has been proposed in a certain way or is being moved to a certain committee. Interest groups tend to spend a great deal of time focused on this, so that when they're talking to their members, they can try and encourage them to act. And this is a distinction that would be worthwhile to mention here. Frequently. When we're talking about interest groups, there's sort of a distinction, there is a distinction between actual members and potential members. So if we're taking something like, well, again, let's say that we're dealing with the state of Texas, there's some sort of bill being proposed about, say, additional restrictions or requirements for becoming a professional engineer in the state of Texas to get signed on as a professional engineer. In Texas, there is almost inevitably going to be the Texas Association of Professional Engineers, or something similarly titled. Again, sort of interest group of people who share an occupation or professional role, professional engineers. Their potential membership of this organization is, in effect, any person who is a professional engineer or training to be a professional engineer in the state of Texas. That population, I have no idea what that population would be. We're just going to make up a number. The potential population of that, so the number of people who are professional engineers or are training professional engineers in this sense, let's say is 60,000 people. That's the potential membership. So theoretically, if everyone who would be a professional engineer, everyone who would count for this interest group, who has this shared passion or shared interest was a member, it would be 60,000 people. That's the potential membership. Versus the actual membership. So the people who are, say, paying dues or providing financial assistance to this organization, people who are actual members of it. So they have a card saying that, yes, I'm a member of the Texas Association of Professional Engineers, someone who's engaged with it, someone who's on their, say, email listserv or get newsletters from them, something of that type. That's the actual membership, and that is almost always going to be significantly smaller. So the actual membership of the Texas Association of Professional Engineers might be 5,000 people. So about 1/12 of the entire population of professional engineers in the state of Texas. One of the big things interest groups try to do is they want to try and increase the number of actual members out of that potential membership. A lot of the activities that they're doing, part of what they're trying to do is to try and encourage the attention of this potential membership to try and get them to be actual members. So again, if we're looking at something like bill monitoring, no offense, you're all great people. Engineers are awesome, but generally speaking, professional engineers generally don't care much about politics, which isn't bad. It's not necessarily a bad thing. They're not going to be paying attention to regulations in the Texas state legislature because they have other things to do. If some sort of bill comes forward trying to restrict or create additional issues for getting registered as a professional engineer, the Texas Association of Professional Engineers will see that, will send out, basically a heads up to their actual members. And part of this is to also try to get their actual members to start contacting potential members. So let's say we're dealing with let's say that Boeing, the aeronautics group, has some of its work in Texas. Out of all the aeronautic engineers who are there, maybe 1 or 2 are actual members. The rest of them aren't. But if those 1 or 2 get this newsletter get this alert from the Texas Association of Professional Engineers saying, look at this bill, this is important, this could have big effects, these 2 members will start talking to the others saying, guys, did you hear about this? This could cause us a lot of problems. We need to get more involved. The idea of trying to activate that potential membership. So people who aren't necessarily involved in politics are now going to say, okay, well, this is going to have an effect on me. I should contact my representative. I should contact others to try and influence their view. No monitoring touches on that. Second is lobbying. This is where an organized group tries to encourage members to vote in a certain way. This is what a great deal of time is usually spent on for interest groups. So this would be meeting with a representative, kind of laying out the case of what you want, trying to encourage them to go one way or the other, maybe also trying to express how this would be important for their constituents or their district. So again, using the Texas Association of Professional Engineers as a hypothetical example. They may send someone to talk to certain members of the, almost inevitably would, to talk to members of the state legislature, saying things like, okay, this could cause a great deal of damage because it'll limit the number of engineers we have. This will limit productivity. This will limit innovation. This will make the state much less attractive to higher tech industries. In terms of your own specific district, so let's say that Boeing unit is in this person's district. If you do this, chances are Boeing's going to have to move out, and your district is going to lose millions of dollars, if not tens of millions of dollars of tax revenue. This is going to be harmful. You should really vote against this bill or amend it to the point where it's not going to be a danger. Now, if you have especially a very well-developed or a very economically powerful type of lobby interest group, sometimes they'll hire professionals to do this, people whose entire job is to act as a lobbyist. So again, let's say that something like the energy producers of Texas, chances are they'll be hiring professional lobbyists, people whose job and career is effectively trying to influence members of the state legislature or the national legislature. This can also get involved with electoral politics. So one way an interest group can try and influence or attempt to influence a politician is by providing money to their election campaigns. There are some pretty strict rules, national rules and state rules, about how much money can be given to a particular politician or group in any given election. There are requirements for, say, reporting on it, things of that type. So it's not like, technically, so if we're talking about something like the energy producers of Texas, they can't say, okay, we're going to give $60 million to this one representative in the state legislature to try and win re-election. By law, they're barred from doing that. And if they did try and do something like that, not only would they be suffering from, say, potential criminal ramifications at the state level, but it would also be a federal offense. So there are limits to it. But that said, you can still provide some money. And this is some way that interest groups can try and be involved in lobbying. That after an election, for instance, one of the ways a lobbyist for an interest group can kind of get their foot in the door to talk to a member of the state legislatures to say, okay, well, remember, our interest group provided X amount of money to your election campaign. We really believed in you. We supported you. We'd like you to hear our case. And generally speaking, the representative is going to say, okay, yeah, sure, we'll arrange an appointment. They may not agree, but they're usually willing to at least listen. This can also be something where an interest group might be involved in, say, more. Again, this is where the lines kind of get a little thin, because technically an interest group and a political party are in most cases dealing with elections, and especially an interest group and a particular political campaign are not permitted to coordinate with each other. That's a rather significant offense. But, so for instance, teachers' unions are a pretty good example of this. Technically, a teachers' union cannot campaign with a specific, say, candidate running for office in the state legislature. But what they can do, so let's say that an issue that's come up is whether teachers' pay should be increased by a certain amount. What a teachers' union can do, and oftentimes do, is that they'll set up a rally, protest, whatever you want to call it. But they'll basically have various of their members, teachers, staff members, what have you, come to do some sort of rally. They'll have their signs and all that saying teachers deserve more, educating the future, whatever other term they'll use. And among other things, they'll also be registering people to vote. Interest groups are oftentimes involved with that, something we'll talk about in a moment. Technically, they're not saying, okay, we're campaigning for State Legislator Smith. Technically, they're not doing that. But if State Legislator Smith has said, yes, we should raise teachers' salaries by 15%, and the teachers' union has a sort of rally saying, yes, we should support people who are going to raise our salary by 15%, this is acting in support of, indirectly, but it's acting in at least parallel support to a specific state legislature. And this is something that could be useful in lobbying, because the interest group can then come back and say, listen, we registered 3,000 people to vote during our rally. Chances are most of them voted for you. We brought people out. We'd like you to listen to what we have to say. Generally, a representative will say, yeah, sure, we'd be happy to listen. Another key thing that comes in is providing information. So again, when we talked about a bill being made, there are various committees, subcommittees, this, that, the other. Any given member of the state legislature is probably going to be on 3 committees and 6 subcommittees, along with trying to write bills, along with serving the constituency. All of this, they've got a lot to do. And this usually means they don't necessarily have time or resources to commission studies on specific topics. So again, going to that initial hypothetical example about professional engineers. The subcommittee that'll be focused on whether these restrictions should be put in place, chances are they don't have the financial resources in that particular subcommittee, and they don't necessarily have the time to say, okay, let's set up a study to see what are going to be the likely economic impacts or the likely innovation impacts of these restrictions. Will it benefit? Will it make it harmful? They don't have the resources, or they don't necessarily have the expertise. The state legislator him or herself is probably, again, a business person, maybe a lawyer, maybe something else, maybe a professor, someone who probably doesn't have much experience with these sort of things. Their staff members are, I don't mean any offense to my field, but a lot of the staff members are probably political science majors, so not exactly people who would know what would be the effects of innovation on restrictions on professional engineers. Texas Association of Professional Engineers could say, okay, listen, we can provide you information. So talking to the subcommittee members, they could say, we can provide you a study by, say, a major association or by a major professor talking about what are the likely effects of this when we've seen restrictions like this in another state, or if we've seen restrictions like this in another country, what will be the likely impact? That's useful information. State legislator, state representative, state senator would want this kind of information. It's the sort of thing that helps them figure out whether or not a bill is worthwhile. Or more to the point, if they already have sort of a position on it. So if a state legislator, a state representative or senator is saying, I'm not so sure about this bill, this additional information provides them greater evidence. So when they're arguing their case saying this bill is a bad idea, we shouldn't do it, please look at this peer-reviewed article by a top economist in the field studying effects on innovation through regulation, who estimates this is going to decrease productivity by 23% in our state. Now that representative has evidence. Now he or she can make her case much more strongly. This again gives an interest group access. Yes, it provides information that's hopefully going to try and make their case, but also if this works. So for the state representative who uses this information to try and make his or her case against the bill, if that works, that representative is going to be a lot more willing to listen to the interest group. Say, okay, well, you've helped me, how can I help you? This is also something that kind of has a built-in check that you want, that an interest group has to make information that at least is plausible. It can't necessarily just outright lie, because the idea is this lie is going to get caught, and a state representative who's using it is going to suffer repercussions both within the state legislature and with his or her constituents. And they're probably going to blow off the interest group from that point forward. So it has to at least seem to be plausible, the information that's being provided. Another thing they're involved in is schmoozing. This one's a little bit more ambiguous, but effectively, you could call it networking, I guess, but trying to be more personally engaged with members of the state legislature, having to be there, going to various events, so on and so forth, to try and at least get the state representative to be a little more familiar with your interest group. And this can involve many sort of informal types of things. Now, the reason why this is one of the things that makes this tricky is that, so kind of like, say, the distinction between networking and favoritism. Favoritism is bad because you're preferring one person over another, not based on their merit, but by various connections you have with them. Versus networking, which is good, where someone's preferring you because of various connections you have with them. Kind of a thin line between, say, schmoozing, where it's just effectively a kind of form of networking, versus trying to get into something more like collusion or potentially unethical or even illegal sort of activities. Something interest groups many times will do, maybe not one of the more preferable things for them to do. Next is grassroots mobilization. So that kind of thing we talked about with the teachers union. This would be an example of grassroots mobilization, trying to energize your potential membership to get more involved. Or going back to the first point, or the hypothetical with the Texas Association of Professional Engineers, if a bill like this was coming forward, most likely what would happen is this association would try and send out messages and emails and other things to basically any professional engineer in the state, and probably also to many students who would be potentially professional engineers within the next 3 to 5 years. Basically, again, informing them about this bill, informing them what it would do, and trying to point them to directions to do something. So like, say, giving a list of the email addresses and phone numbers of state representatives, say, please call your state representative. But also having things like, if you'd like to support us, here is where you can make donations to the Texas Association of Professional Engineers. Would you like to be a member? We'd love to have you. This being where you're trying to energize those potential members. At least inside this one case, so you want them to be emailing or talking to their state representatives, or potentially making them actual members of the organization. Then there are political action committees. This is where it collects money for the specific purposes of elections. This one happens at the state level. This is more of a national issue. This is something that's kind of new-ish. I guess we just got the notice of how many people have gotten sick, I guess. Okay, whatever. Joy of the ESRAS, however you pronounce the system. In effect, these sorts of organizations are a reflection of federal national election law, of being able to put together money for elections, but that can't directly be aimed at a specific party or a specific candidate. So this would be something like a political action committee focused on, say, trying to have more open gun rights or something like that. Technically, it can't be providing funds for a specific party or candidate, but it might use those funds to have commercials saying that, yes, these are the reasons why we should have freer gun rights. In an election, if there's one candidate who is very much in support of that, one who's against it, yeah, technically you're not directly aiding a specific party or candidate. But again, a person can put two and two together about who would be preferred in this case. And then electoral funds and volunteers, again, kind of similar to some of the efforts with lobbying. Before continuing, any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns on any of that? A couple other things to note with interest groups is, so in many ways they can serve a very positive function. They provide information. They can, again, as part of this element of this civil society, they can put forward the preferences or ideas of various parts of the population in a more sort of coherent and focused way than they might be able to do on their own. A lot of benefits to interest groups. Having said that, they can also have many negative influences. And so oftentimes when people talk about interest groups, they don't mean it in necessarily a positive way. And indeed, many interest groups will oftentimes try and find like an advocacy group or a public interest group. They'll oftentimes not directly call themselves an interest group because it tends to have sort of a negative connotation. So one of the big examples of this would be economically strong interest groups. That the idea is they can dominate in a way that other interest groups can't, that the general population can't, and especially if this is a problem at the state level. So again, something like the energy producers of Texas as a hypothetical example. This would be an economically strong interest group. The state of Texas is highly dependent upon the energy industry. Therefore, this is an interest group that, even if it's so kind of going from interest group to faction, if there would be something that would be strongly beneficial to the energy sector that might not necessarily be beneficial to the state, to the general population or something of that type, given the economic strength of the energy sector, they can probably strongly influence the Texas state legislature to do what they would want, just because the threat of these organizations leaving would cause substantial economic damage to the state of Texas, versus, say, again, at like the national level, kind of going to that example from earlier in the semester. And yeah, actually look at this as a comparison. If Microsoft and say the various computer industries inside the state of Washington, if they threaten to leave the United States could say, well, unless a certain policy was changed, the American government could say, well, good luck. Try and find some place you're going to get a better deal. You're probably not. I guess you could go to China. I mean, they only occasionally execute CEOs. I'm sure maybe you'll luck out. Good luck. They know that the threat is really there. And even if Microsoft would leave, the American economy would still be fine. Versus the state of Washington. If Microsoft threatens to leave, if the computer industries threaten to leave Washington, the economy of Washington would be gutted in many ways. It's an economically strong group of interests, and therefore they're probably going to be able to influence the state legislature in a pretty significant way. Also, interest groups can have a sort of particular niche where they can bully sort of state governments. So again, important industries like the energy industry in Texas, the computer industry in Washington would be examples, but also certain types of public sector unions. So if you're looking at, say, like the teachers' unions inside the state of Illinois, they have a particular niche because they tend to have a very active membership base, and again, also because they're very media savvy. So if there's a question, so one of the things that's caused the state of Illinois to almost go bankrupt and might still go bankrupt is they tend to have very generous pensions for state workers, especially for teachers. So if you've worked as a teacher for say 20, 30 years, you can retire and your pension would be basically having 50% or maybe even 75% of your monthly salary for the rest of your life. Not bad, not bad. That would be kind of a nice way to retire. One of the ways they've gotten this is because they tend to be very good at grassroots activity, pushing for certain types of candidates to win, and again, because they can threaten in a certain sense. So the idea would be, and this sort of thing has happened, if the state legislature says, okay, we're going to raise teacher salaries by 3% instead of 5%. Teachers' unions will come out, they'll have a big rally, again, being very media savvy, you'll have a bunch of teachers saying, why are you starving teachers? Why do you not care about the children? Why are you cutting our pay? Cutting basically meaning we're only raising it by 3% instead of 5%, but this is a cut. On the news, when most people are watching, they're saying, why? Well, I mean, of course we like teachers, so we don't hate children. Well, of course we want to make sure they have enough money. That's a pretty powerful niche. And this is something that, especially in a state like Illinois, has to strengthen this interest group to the point where it can kind of push state governments to do what they want. And this is aside from, say, the more blatant forms of corruption where you can have bribery, voter fraud, voter intimidation, things of that type, things that are blatantly illegal, of course. Any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns? Righto. Well, with that being the case, we'll finish up here, and that means next time we will actually deal with political parties instead of doing sort of throat clearing about everything else. So again, this should be online soon. I have to admit it's been a while since I've uploaded something to YouTube, so we'll see how good my memory is with that. Once I've gotten that together, we'll send you the links. We'll still work to see if there's some way I can get this on Canvas, and hopefully be able to have some redundancy there. Otherwise, on Sunday, we will continue on with political parties, starting with political culture and how that can influence these things, and moving on from there. Additionally, the new schedule should be out soon, and yeah, should all go well. So that being the case, please do have a good weekend, and I will see you next week, hopefully in person.